Hey, what's up, everyone? Dragon back again, here to tell you that you should be reading Reliquary. So, Reliquary is a 1997 thriller novel written by Douglas Preston Lincolnchild and serves as the sequel to their bestseller Relic, which we talked about before on this show. And basically, this story takes place some few years after, with a series of murders that start taking place throughout New York City that in some ways resemble those that were taking place in the Museum of Natural History in New York City prior, that would later be found out to be responsible for the museum beast, aka Umboon. So naturally, a lot of the returning cast is back in this one, hence why they call it the returning cast, and they start to worry, they start to suspect that maybe these killings are connected, that maybe that there are more of these creatures out there. So naturally, everyone starts looking into the situation, and basically, this search or this kind of investigative quest leads them kind of down into the underbelly of the city, where a lot of what they call the mole people live. Basically, like a lot of the homeless people who have kind of created entire civilizations, if you will, organizations, and kind of just uh, communal cultures is probably the best way to describe it, deep underground in the subway systems and even below. And basically, this story is kind of, whereas the museum beast, the relic, the killings and the nature in which that story took place and how it took place was more of like what they described as like a Jaws in the museum kind of story. This is a story, strangely enough, a bit more about classism and kind of how our preconceived notions of certain groups of people based on their social economic standing lead us to kind of make determinations about people and perhaps ignore warning signs that we would otherwise spot right away because we're just not paying attention. And in this case, a lot of these killings start with homeless people. A lot of these moles are kind of being driven up, and where a lot of people who kind of watch them, study them, are telling them this is a problem, this is a sign of something. The overall kind of social hierarchy throughout the city, it doesn't really pay attention, and because of that, all this kind of goes unchecked until the body of like a young, beautiful, rich, white socialite turns up, and now suddenly the city is in uproar. Now suddenly everyone is, focusing on these killings because, someone of prestige, has been affected. And that's kind of what the story is about. It's not so much that the killings are happening, it's why we only take notice when people that we feel are more important than others because of superficial reasons, are affected by it. Now, I won't spoil kind of the twist of this story because if I kind of tell you specifically who or what is behind these killings, it'll kind of give away a big chunk of the plot that's kind of meant to be a surprise. But know that it is directly linked to the events of the first book and leads into this one in a very interesting way. But whereas, again, the other book was kind of a more classic creature feature slash kind of who is the real monster, the monster itself, or the people who are essentially allowing the monster to do what it does because of what they're afraid of losing by exposing it. This is a story about kind of humanity's almost cannibalistic nature towards itself, in the sense that we purposely segregate sections of our own society from one another, so we create classes where that are meant to be better than others, since essentially just for the sake of one group being better than somebody else. It creates kind of almost like this pyramid form of society where there are some who sit at the very top, and usually there are the very few. And as you kind of go down, it gets wider with larger populations of people being more disadvantaged, more disenfranchised, and that's kind of what it's about, is analyzing just how severe this kind of this hierarchy is, and why do we segregate ourselves? Why do we put ourselves above other groups of people? And is doing so perhaps a detriment to the whole? Because again, this problem would have come to light much sooner had the people at the very top been paying more attention to the people at the very bottom. But because they weren't, this problem was allowed to grow, allowed to escalate. These killings were becoming more prevalent. These killers were becoming more emboldened because they were being left unchecked. Because the people they were initially killing when they were starting out were people that mainstream society just didn't give a damn about. And because of that, they were allowed to kind of push upwards into the upper echelons of society, till finally they're killing people like you and me. So it's a question of, is our inability to just kind of essentially just treat everyone equally what ultimately might bite us in the ass, and in this case maybe a little bit literally, because essentially, we are closing ourselves off to entire groups of people, therefore making them easy targets. And once whatever is killing them gets through them, it is now that much closer to us. And when it gets through us, it gets that much closer to people in power. And depending on your own particular tax bracket, that might be you. So, with that said, Reliquary, a different beast, no pun intended, than Relic, but very much a worthy successor, and forces us in a lot of ways to take a harder look on ourselves. I mean, the characters who are basically enabling the killings in the first book, while definitely a commentary on kind of the human condition, were also very much a certain type of person, and it'd be very easy for us to say, that's not us. Whereas the problem in this story stems from something that, quite frankly, more than likely, we're all guilty of to some degree. It is very easy to turn a blind eye to people in need, and we know out there are people who are starving. We know there are people who are impoverished, and we know there are people who are sick. We know there are people who are dying. But if it's out of sight, out of mind, it's very much just that. It's very easy just to not think about it if it's not thrown right in front of you. So if those people are being killed off versus your friends, your neighbors, it's very easy just to really not notice and, unfortunately, not care. And this story kind of forces humanity to take a look at itself. If our culture, if our society, if our species was being infiltrated, if we were being attacked, killed off by a new kind of predator, would we necessarily notice right away? We always assume that it'd be something big and lavish and flashy, but if it, like any predator, it goes after the sick, it goes after the weak, and in this case would go after the disenfranchised, aka the people we don't really know about and the people we quite frankly don't really care about. So if a few homeless people turn up dead, so what? That's just life. A rich socialite turns up dead, suddenly we have a problem. But why is that? Why do we feel that way about one but not about the other? And that's what this story does a good job of asking you, the reader. It forces you to take a look at yourself and really ask yourself, why? And again, is this way of thinking, this train of thought, this logic, really for the best? Because in case of this story, like I said, this is a problem that might have been able to be dealt with all the sooner had we just kind of treated, again, everybody as equal. And I know that maybe sounds a little hippy-dippy and like let's all get along and love each other. But the reality is, if we all did, this problem would have been stopped much sooner. So Reliquary, like I said, different than Relic, but expands upon the concepts and notions both on the science fiction level and on the social level that book kind of started. Again, a very worthy successor to the first book. However, unlike the first book, was not turned into a feature film, unfortunately. But like I said, we'll talk about Relic the movie on the You Should Be Watching series, despite its large differences from the book. But Reliquary, and a good thing about Reliquary, you do not need to read Relic first, although I highly recommend you read Relic before you read this book. But I actually read Reliquary before I read Relic, interestingly enough, and I didn't find myself really lost. I felt that within its pages, it did a good job of kind of summarizing the events of the first book, while kind of just hitting all the key points that made what happened in that first book relevant to what was happening in the sequel. So at no point did I really feel lost. I never really felt like, well, I don't really get this. I felt they kind of brought up what was necessary from the first book and worked it into the events happening in its sequel. So with that said, Reliquary, have you read it? If so, what did you think? Did you like it better than Relic? Did you not like it better than Relic? Anyway, I'll leave some links in the description section below where you can pick up the book, so you can go check it out, come back, leave some comments, let me know what you think. And as always, guys, thanks for watching. Peace!